Welcome back, everybody. I just wanted to take some time and go over my stats in my Climb to World's Finest this year, and we'll talk about the meta along with this. Should be good. We have some hopeful insights that we tend to bring. If you want more meta stats thing, Blade actually did a very good video on this as well, and he used some aggregated data, so a little bit of a bigger data set, but the results, as you will see, are the same. So out of our whole climb from Gold 25 down to World's Finest, we played 142 total games. Of those 142 total games, we ran into Tactics 73 times, Anarchy 55 times, Tyranny 53 times, Might 55 times, and Energy 51 times. And that is running into it as far as if at least one leader from that faction was selected. We'll start off in Energy, which was the least played faction of my run to World's Finest, and the least played leader was Hal Jordan. Only 3 games out of the 51 total games that we saw Energy in, which is only a 2.1% play rate. Slightly above him is going to be Zatanna, which we saw in 6 games, which is a 4.2% play rate. Next up is the Flash, which we saw in 20 games, making him a 14% play rate, but as we'll see here in the end, a lot of that comes in Flash Doomsday. Shazam we saw in 22 different games with a respectable 15.5% play rate, so not too bad. Anarchy's up next. We saw Black Adam out of the 53 total Tyranny games once, which is a 0.8% play rate. So if we played 100 games, we saw him maybe once, which is pretty abysmal, to be honest. General Zod we saw in 9 games, giving him a 6.3% play rate. Not surprised in this since he was a new leader that did come out in the middle of our climb, so definitely some experimentation. I'd be curious to know what this number is at the end. Lex we saw 7 times, which is a little surprising. Lex Luthor has really fallen off. He's only seen in 4.9% of our games. And the one that holds Tyranny down is Poison Ivy, which we saw in 36 games, making her play rate 25.4%, which is quite a bit. Up next, we have Might with Superman, seeing 9 games of play, which is 6.3%, and that is out of the 53 total Might games we played. Just above him is Wonder Woman at 12 games, which is a little surprisingly low, only 8.5% play rate. Aquaman holds down Might, being seen in 32 of our 53 total Might games at 22.5%, so he is seen just under the amount that Poison Ivy is in the meta. Up next we have Anarchy, and out of the 55 total games we played with Anarchy, we saw the Batman Who Laughs 7 times, giving him nearly a 5% play rate, which is a little surprising. The Joker is next, which we saw in 15 games, giving him a 10.6% play rate. Just above him is Doomsday with 16 games played, and again, most of these games were Flash Doomsday, as we'll see, and that gives him an 11.3% play rate. And about the same, Harley Quinn at 17 games seen at a 12% play rate, so not too bad. This brings us to Tactics, which we saw in 73 of our 142 games, which is half. So half the time we fought a Tactics leader. And the lowest Tactics leader was Cyborg at 5 games, only a 3.5% play rate. Green Arrow we saw in 8 games, which is a 5.6% play rate, though I do think toward the end of our climb, Green Arrow started to become a little bit more popular within the meta. Batgirl we saw 11 games at a 7.8% play rate, and many of those games was the Batgirl Joker deck. And here he is, the king of the meta. We saw Batman in 49 games. That is 34.5%, so nearly 10% higher than the next highest leader played, and that is 1 out of every 3 games that is played in DC Dual Force contains Batman. Through our climb, we only saw 4 decks that broke over 10 occurrences as far as specific leader combinations go, so we'll go over that. So the most popular decks of the meta, the number 4 deck was Batgirl Ivy, we saw 10 times, giving it this leader combination a 7% play rate. So 7% of the games we queued up, we ran into Batman, Poison Ivy. And those numbers reflect 20% of the games that we saw Batman in and 28% of the games that we saw Ivy in. That would mean all the games that included Batman, 20% of the time it was Batman, Poison Ivy, and with Ivy, all of the games we saw Ivy in, 28% of those games were this specific leader combination and deck. Next up, we saw for 11 of our games was Flash Doomsday. So that is a 7.8% of the time we queue into exactly Flash Doomsday, and this accounted for 69% of all Doomsday games which Doomsday appeared in, and 55% of all games that the Flash appeared in, which is quite a bit. This deck was definitely the standard for if you were going to play Flash, and especially Doomsday. Just above Flash Doomsday, the second most popular deck, which we saw in 8.5% of our games, so 12 games, was Shazam Batman. These Shazam Batman games accounted for 25% of the play we saw Batman with and 55% of the games that we saw Shazam with, which really kind of says a lot about Shazam, I think. It also says a lot about Batman, but we'll get there. But Shazam being half the time tied to this exact deck was actually a little surprising for me, especially with all of the Ivy Shazam or Cyborg Shazam we have seen in the past, but not this month. And that leaves us with the most popular deck of this meta, which of course, no surprise, is Batman Aquaman, which we saw exactly 17 times, which makes it a 12% play rate for this exact deck. So 12% of the time we queued into exactly Batman Aquaman. These Batman Aquaman games accounted for 35% of all the Batman we saw on the ladder and 53% of all the Aquaman we saw on the ladder. A couple points I'd like to make off this is Ivy seems to be the other leader that can really stand alone outside of Batman, as the combination with Batman was only 28% of her games, so Ivy was maybe the most diverse leader as far as all the decks she was included in outside of Batman, which I think firmly cements Ivy as the number 2 leader in the game as far as usage. And when we go back and compare this to how the pairing of Batman Aquaman and Batman Shazam pushed the individual play rate, the percentage of games played with Aquaman when combined with Batman was over half the games Aquaman was seen in. Same for Shazam, which is startling to say the least. But enough about these side characters. Let's talk about the menace that was Batman's play rate. We saw Batman alone in 49 games out of our 142, which gives him a 35% play rate nearly, which is fairly incredible if we're going to be honest. With these kind of numbers, it's no surprise that 3 out of the 4 most played decks in the meta right now contain a Batman. 2 of those decks, their leaders mostly see play with specifically Batman, Ivy being the outlier as we have already discussed. I don't want to be the guy that is going to shout from the rooftops that Batman definitely needs a nerf, but at a 35% play rate, something might need to be done. The meta is not going to change if Batman continues his now 3-month dominant hold upon the meta. I don't know how that looks as far as if Batman is nerfed. I don't know what cards in the tactics package you can specifically target to try to get this play rate down, but I don't think it's a card problem. I definitely think we are suffering from a Batman problem, all in all. In Blade's Metastats video, he made a great point that if in any other card game, if we saw a saturation of 35%, for example, Hearthstone, if we saw Druid in 35% of all games played, he would get the Nerf hammer in a hot second. And I think DC Dual Force might need to take a page out of that. When you have one leader that is just this dominant over the rest of the field, something needs to happen to balance out. It's unfortunate that we see some of these other leaders so less. I mean, we saw Batman alone 13 games more than the next most played leader as Poison Ivy, and 17 games more than the most next played leader, which would be Aquaman. And both of those, especially Aquaman, was heavily reliant on the Batman combination. all in all, I definitely think we need some kind of shakeup if we want this meta not to go stale. We cannot continue down this path of Batman seeing a third of all games played when we have 19 different leaders. Even when you take out the top 3 most played leaders, the next most played leader is Shazam, which is still 10 games behind the third place. And most of those games, 55% of those games, as we saw, are directly paired with Batman. So we definitely, I think I'll say it, we have a Batman problem. These have been my meta stats for my climb from World to World's Finest, from Gold 25 all the way to World's Finest. Again, 142 games, and as the stats reflect, I definitely think the game needs some amount of balancing changes to allow some of these other leader combinations and possible other decks to be able to shine through, especially with Batman Aquaman for the second month in a row being completely dominant over the rest of the field. I wish we had specific deck win rates, and I hope one day, maybe in the next month, we'll get some better data and better aggregate data to assess the actual win rates of these decks. But I assume these big 3 decks are the win rate for them is going to be significantly higher than a lot of these other decks out there, especially when you look at leaders that have less than 10 games played, less than 5 games played. I assume the win rates on those decks are near abysmal when compared to something like Batman Aquaman. So just some thoughts. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys saw the similar thing or what other stats you saw. And if you want more analysis on meta breakdown and these stats, please go check out Blade's video. Again, he did a really great one. These are only my stats, and he was able to aggregate a lot more data than me.